Hello and welcome to Hastings Public Library's virtual book club. Joining me today is Sam, Erica, and Joseph. We're going to be talking about the book Prairie Forge, The Extraordinary Story of the Nebraska Scrap Metal Drive of World War II by James Kimble. This is a One Book Nebraska book, and we're so happy that we could also have had him here to discuss the Prairie Forge with us. So let's go ahead and get right to it. You guys ready? Ready? Was the Nebraska Scrap Metal Drive truly extraordinary? What do you guys think?
I think it was. I think it was extraordinary the amount of metal that they collected in the scrap. But one of the overarching things for me was just how the communities came together. It was incredible how they put their racial and ethnic and all those differences aside for the greater good, and were somewhat militarized themselves. I thought it was very successful. Well, and they kept the steel plants going. So
yeah, kept jobs going.
Yeah. Who knows what the war would have turned out like?
Yeah. Anybody else have a thought?
Yeah, I thought
the extent of it was extraordinary. They gathered a lot more scrap than I thought would even be lying around.
I think thinking about it in 2021, it does feel very extraordinary because I'm always constantly imagining how would this go in the present day. So yeah, in that retrospect, it does feel pretty extraordinary.
Do you think that we in 2021 that we could all come together like that to do something like that? Or do you think that would be a fight?
That was a question I was going to bring up, was what would this look like in 2021? And I don't know. I think I'm very sort of pessimistic about it, in that I think everyone seems to hold on to what they have so much. I think the numbers would not be as much, and I think there'd be a lot more controversy around it, at least a lot more than what this book presents. But I also think, 1942 was in the midst of a world war. So that's a totally different context that we have fortunately not experienced. And when the stakes are much higher like they were back then, I think maybe it would be different and there would be as much of a push. And with modern technology, maybe a bit more ability to find all that scrap metal and just get a whole bunch for the steel plant. So
well, and I don't mean this in a mean way or anything, but in 2021 we have so many things. We have so many material items that they didn't have the luxury of in 1942. And the things that they were finding were old bathtubs and old tractors, and even the lady's son's toys. Those were the only possessions that she had left of him. So I think they went down really to the nuts and bolts. It'd be interesting to see what we would find in comparison to them. I always wondered, when you go to a museum, it's like, why aren't there more hats? Why aren't there more guns? Why aren't there more things as far as artifacts? Well, they're all in the scrap heap, and they repurpose themselves as a ship or a plane or a bullet. So that was really interesting for me.
The one part that I thought was funny is everybody's gathering, and they're out going through the countryside looking for scrap metal, and they start to take down a windmill.
A functioning windmill.
But it was functioning. They didn't think it was. And that part had me chuckle.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
It's like, yes, that's technically theft. It belongs to someone. They're using it right now. It's a little busy.
You will destroy this man's farm.
Sure. It's like food's also very important to the war effort. You also need to eat.
Yeah. So which underlying theme of the Nebraska plan was most important in its success? Competition and camaraderie, tractors and tricycles, or fact and fancy? Oh, that is a really tough question.
Oh, I think the competition and camaraderie.
I
Because it seems like
do.
a lot of the people came together, oh, we can outdo those guys. Let's go. And
I think that's the most important. I just think that the fact and the fancy is really what drove them though, because the competition really got them inspired to compete against each other, but they used fancy as far as showing in the newspaper how if you turn in a golf club, that could become a machine gun, or a part of a woman's straight iron could become I can't remember what they said, but some kind of munition. But I think the most important part definitely was the camaraderie. It brought the whole nation together in a way that I wish would still happen today,
Yeah.
honestly.
yeah.
I definitely agree. It's something about that magic of like having a competitive element, but also knowing you're all working together for one good cause. I think you see that in things from time to time still, and it's just this very these motivations that really work to bring people together and get things done. So I definitely agree that that was the most important. But I would also say tractors and tricycles really helped emphasize that you don't have to have tons and tons of scrap metal to be important. Saying every little piece counts definitely helped get everyone involved, because there were definitely people who didn't have access to those things. So
Let's see. In what ways did Nebraska football play a role in the scrap drive? It was definitely used as a metaphor for how the scrap drive was going, given that the first half, even though there was a delay in the results, it wasn't the turnout they were really hoping for. So they described it as like a second half push. Like if the Huskers can turn it around in the second half of football, then we could definitely turn around the second half of the scrap drive. As the numbers started coming in, it really did turn around.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it was so motivational for Nebraskans just because that was something that unified everyone as well. There were so many supporters of the Cornhuskers that if you throw that in there, people understood that lingo.
that's what I was going to say. It's a very effective metaphor for the state to use, because that's always been important. It still is. So yeah. So early on in the book, Life magazine's writers contended that the Nebraska plan, quote, was the US really going to war? What do you think they meant by that? I think it's kind of like, of course, there are all these soldiers and stuff going overseas and fighting these battles, but with that scrap metal drive, it started to bring everyone in. And the US, which never really has a lot of home front effect, like all of our wars for the past many years or so have been overseas. There's not been a lot of effect here in the continental United States. So that sort of got people here in the United States moving and going and doing something that was especially for the war. So
well, and it's so easy to sit when you're over here and they're fighting over there. You do think of them and you send your prayers and well wishes, but it's not the same thing as really being active in somehow aiding the war. And this was very powerful just because if they didn't aid, the war was going to suffer. And we were sending our metal over to Japan and places that were turning our metal into ships and guns and basically going to win the war against us with our own scrap, which is really interesting, I thought. But it did make the country feel like they were going to war just as much, maybe not just as much, but they were actually actively supporting the troops.
Right.
Instead of just, I wish you well, the well wishes and all that good stuff. That's truly heartfelt, but they really gave their heart to go to war too, I think.
Well, yeah, just because, hey, we're not there, we're not, in the trenches fighting with you, but here, we're going to help you by giving part of us to you. Giving our metal, our tractor. Here you go.
Supplying you with what you need.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other? How do you think a similar drive would play out if it happened in 2021? We kind of touched on that a little bit. I don't know. I really don't know how it would go.
I
They
kind of think it's interesting. It's interesting to think about your personal life, like how much scrap metal could you offer to a
Hmm.
drive like this? And I mean, I'm not thinking about the small things. And I think that's why those tractors and tricycles are so important, because I'm like, I have nothing big that I could give to this. But yeah, it's in the
Well-
little things that I don't use every day that I need to think about. And
Nowadays, everything is plastic.
True.
that's
Our
Yeah.
cars are plastic, majority of it, our dishes, everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
The kids' toys. We just don't really have the metal that they did.
Mhm.
Good
It
point.
definitely
And then
might
it-
have to be for a different resource. Definitely, maybe not metal in and of itself, because it's like you said, most things now are plastic, not necessarily metal. Also, they would definitely have to use a different platform than the newspaper, because probably nowadays maybe social media would be better, given that it's more of an instantaneous result. Like you could actually see the current updated results of a drive instead of having to wait a few days for a count.
Well, and so many people don't trust the media
To say,
right now. So, yeah, they've kind of shunned away from that. A lot of people don't have local TV because they're watching streaming services. So, yeah, I think you would have to go with the Facebook and the Instagram and the Twitter and TikToks and everything just to help get the
Mm.
drive going.
I think you would need somebody like a Henry Dorley to really get things going, because just like they said in the book, as far as you have, oh gosh, what was it? It was talking about having the government roll it out was having the coordinators coordinating the other coordinators. So they didn't really communicate it with anybody. They were watching each other and talking to each other, but it didn't get cascaded down to the people it needed to. And then when Henry Dorley could do it, they were amazed at well, why are they listening to him and not to us? It would be very much the same thing, I think, today, is we'd need that powerful spokesperson or somebody to get it really going, because honestly, with how the country's always divided on our leadership, I just don't think that, them telling us would really get the ball going very well.
Who do you guys
Plus, the
think?
initial rollout seemed to be caught up in its own red tape and logistics. It didn't really get to everyone it needed to get to.
Who do you think would be the modern day Henry Dorley? Do you have an opinion on that? David?
It's tough.
And are we thinking like Nebraska wide, or like
Yeah,
who
just
would-
Nebraska, just Nebraska.
I mean, if there's like an actual war the size of the world war going on, I think people like the really big, like Jimmy Buffett, like, or someone like that could step up and say, hey, let's do this. I think that could also be brought back with pushback, because then it's like, oh, but you have all these funds. Or how much are you helping? And it is, yeah, it's very sort of, I don't know, a bit, when I first think about it, very sad to think about how this would go down in 2021. So very, very reactionary, and I feel more conflict than we see in Prairie Forge, the book. So
Well, I think we would need someone that would definitely lead by example, not just tell us, because technology wise, you can tell us until you're purple, but until we see you out there
Right.
lugging it with us, you might not have much credibility.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think of all the media and ballyhoo surrounding the scrap drive? Were there any measures that struck you particularly strongly or crossed the line?
Can you imagine if they saw today's media stuff?
Oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh.
No. Well, I love the word ballyhoo, and I wrote it down just so I could remember the page and look it up. It's just the a colorful way to describe, oh, let me see here.
89.
It says referring to dramatic, colorful, and occasionally bizarre publicity, which I really thought did the job, and that's where it reached the fancy. You know,
Mhm.
even toward the end where they had the crude drawings of Hitler and Mussolini and whoever else, I can't blanking right now, but
Hirohito from Japan.
yes,
Yeah.
there you go. But
Yeah, I always think of,
nope, go ahead.
I was always thinking of that one image he talks about where it's the woman holding the piece of scrap metal like a gun. I don't know, I really like symbolic things like that. And that was kind of amazing to see, like, oh, someone put thought into making this look this way and presenting it so that it got people thinking consciously or subconsciously about the war and how their efforts were relating to it. So I really liked that image. I did think though sometimes it did feel, and maybe this is just 2021 fake news perspective, but it felt like a lot of it really hinged on like over exaggeration and it wasn't fully factual. And I don't know, it just felt kind of weird to me. I mean, it got the job done, so there's that, but at times it did feel a little questionable. So
They definitely took some, I don't know if artistic liberties is the right word, maybe.
Well, and when it talks about ballyhoo, you know, when I'm thinking crazy, colorful, dramatic, to them, a woman in the material was probably pretty crazy, holding a machine gun as a reference.
Because
know,
a
that-
woman wouldn't have been carrying one.
Right. And she wouldn't have probably been part of the plan and been so instrumental in inspiring people. I don't know. Do you think there was anything that crossed the line?
I mean,
We
I
talked
think
about theft earlier.
Talked about what?
Theft. You
Yeah.
can't steal people's bills.
And I think, I mean, Kimball's really good about talking up front about, hey, some of this language was used back then. It's not appropriate now, but it's good. Or he says he's going to use it. I don't know whether it's good or not to make that choice, but he's clear about that. And yeah, some of those advertisements and word choice would not stand as a present, but it's a different time. So
Yeah. And back to what Erica said about the theft, there was even one part that made me kind of laugh. It was when, was it New Jersey snuck over to New York and loaded up a bunch of their scrap. And then they made a comment about, oh, they didn't make a comment back to them. Well, it was because they were busy weighing New York scrap. I thought that was kind of funny. I mean, it was definitely a competition, and whether or not it was ethical all the time, I don't think so, but
They literally had to have people guard the scrap at night so people wouldn't come steal it.
yeah. Well, both the Nebraska scrap drive and the National scrap drive are talked about less often than other events in World War II, despite its apparently vital status. What does this say about how we track the history of wars?
I just thought that was really interesting how, I mean, I learned about World War II in school and stuff and from then, but I had not really heard about the scrap drive, even though it's apparently very, very important. So I think when we talk about war, we tend to talk about what's going on the battlefields and the actual sort of measures and who's fighting who at what point and dates and stuff. But there's all this stuff that's going on, the scrap drive, but like war bonds and victory gardens. And I think sort of the culture of countries that are at home that are involved in the war is also very interesting and very important. It's a good reference for what to do should this ever happen again, or how you can help people, or what works and what doesn't. So yeah, I think it's interesting how this wasn't a measure that was highlighted until this book, of course, is the scrap drive. So
Yeah, you don't really hear anything about this kind of effort by the people, I guess you could say.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's not as flashy after the fact per se. Like with battles, you can easily say who won, who lost, did anything really important or major happen because of it. With this, it's more subdued. And yeah, there was a competitive aspect to it, but the stakes were much lower. And yeah, I think it's just not as sort of the same way we see news now. We always see the sort of major and dramatic and oftentimes horrific things that are going on as opposed to good stories and minor stories. So
True, it was a positive story and not about the casualties, and
mhm.
that's very true.
Does Kimble effectively refute claims that the importance of the scrap drive is overstated?
So I kind of feel like I was expecting to see, okay, this all sounds so great and everything. I mean, once again, 2021, but surely there were people who weren't so ready to go and amped up. So I kind of wondered, where was the opposition that maybe this wasn't as important, or maybe it didn't work as well. And I finally got to that in the epilogue where he writes a lot about, oh, people have said it wasn't as important as it may seem. And I don't know, I think it would have been better had it been spread out throughout the narrative and taken on those moments when they really made sense in the story. Um, yeah, I just wasn't expecting it all in the epilogue there.
Mm,
To a certain degree, it seems to be viewed through the, what do they call that? Not necessarily like the rose-colored glasses of the past, but like you look maybe more nostalgia, like you look back and think things were better than they actually were. Like, look how everyone came together and got along, even though that's obviously not exactly what happened. Like, there was still racism and we still treated people terribly, but like on the outside looking in, it seems like for a moment everyone could come together, and that's a story that makes people happier.
Mhm.
that's a good point. Well, what impact did the scrap drive have on the environment? I'm sure it saved our groundwater. Well,
No, that's what I was thinking.
it did some kind of
Yeah.
saving the groundwater and the soil, because they didn't just have all these places to take old tractors. You dumped it in the heat. Your
Well, yeah, you
mattress
just-
went bad, you dump it in the heat.
You just put it out in the pasture.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed like a tractor or a car or a boat or something would randomly die, and they would just leave it like on insert whatever acre. It's like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like, doesn't that like metals like run off into like the groundwater and cause problems?
Yeah.
So it's gonna affect wells. It's a
Well, and
terrible
I mean-
idea.
honestly, it becomes a habitat for the critters and everything else too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not going away for a while. So if it's sitting there, it's just going to sit there, and who knows what sort of piles we might see today if not for this effort. So
Well, and you can see kids, climbing in these piles. At least we did that stuff as kids, where it's like, ooh, a pile of junk. Let's go climb on
Yeah.
it, where you're gonna poke yourself or get tetanus or glass or anything like that.
Well, even back in the late 80s, they would take those old cars and strip them
Mm-hmm.
to where they were just the shells. I mean, literally, the tires were off, the seats were out, and they would let glass everything and let kids climb all through them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kind of like a
So-
little playground equipment thing.
Yeah.
So I know, I think of all the millions of tons of scrap that they found. I'm grateful that they did, and I'm grateful it's not in the ground or in
It
the
was
homes
recycled.
or, yeah,
They actually were probably one of the first recyclers.
yeah,
If you
absolutely.
think about it. Because you can't do that with the plastics of today.
No,
mhm.
They don't
Fiberglass.
decompose nicely. They're trying to work on that, from what I've heard.
yep.
And
Was
it's not
there
like
any-
steel where it can be reused in the same way. So
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there anything about the steel making process that surprised you?
I didn't know that it was easier to make more steel using scrap. I'd never thought much about the steel making process beforehand, but I didn't know it was easier to use stuff you already made to make more new stuff.
Right, you mix it with the iron ore, so it was more, I think, malleable, maybe is the right word.
That could be, that makes sense.
And well, yeah, it was more bendable or whatever, but then it lasted longer. I can't remember, something in the book was talking about because it already had the impurifications melted down, and then you mix it with the iron ore, it was more stable. So I thought that was really interesting.
Mhm.
yeah, that's something I think I'm very distant from, where I'm just like, oh yeah, they could just get more iron and make more
Mhm.
steel. But yeah, I guess it makes sense to just use the existing iron and remix that with more to make steel and go from there. That's another thing where here in the present we think about, oh, everything just comes from its raw materials and comes new and fresh to us. But I don't know if it's still that way or if that's just the way things are. So
Well, and I remember as a kid when, mom takes you shopping for your notebooks for school and things, I remember buying the recycled notebooks, and I always thought, I wonder what this was. I didn't know if it was, just a tree or if it was paper towels previously, or you know what I mean? Something that someone had used and put to good use, and then now I'm using it. I always wondered about that, but I never dug into learning more about it. So I thought this book did a good job at explaining things. And even in the very, very beginning, it explained even how you get, or not mine, I guess I'll use mine, what the rock, the minerals are in it. It was just a little bit of entertaining in the book, but then it was also quite a bit of learning for me.
mhm.
Oh, yeah, it had a lot of stuff that, like you said, you didn't learn about in school. This had a lot of that history that you didn't hear about. So, yeah.
Well, we
I
really
mean,
didn't. Sorry, Joseph, go ahead.
I checked the appendix, and I'm from Fillmore County, and looked there, and we did not do very good in the in the 1942 drive. So, but here in Adams County, they did a little better. So,
And we really didn't talk about Henry Dorley, but the book he was a huge part in it, which I did not know anything about. I just know Henry Dorley Zoo. I didn't know that he was such an
What-
important part of the World Herald. And
Didn't he start the World Herald?
he
Or he was the
he
publisher?
married, he was the publisher and editor, he married into it. But that's one thing I like too. If the story is accurate, it was his wife that he was whining to, saying, well, this was a flop and this could have been done better. And she was just, well, what are you going to do about it? And got out of the car and got on a train, so kind of like, you figure it out, stop whining about it. So I thought that was a really interesting story. And just learning about his history. Where was he from? Oh darn, I can't remember, but
I
he's,
believe he immigrated from
He was
somewhere in the
an immigrant,
Caribbean.
wasn't he?
yes, Barbados.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I thought that was interesting. And then he came here, and I mean, he married well, but he obviously did very well for himself and cared about what he did. So I really enjoyed learning a lot about him, but you really didn't learn about his wife after that initial conversation in the car. But
Mhm. I also like the way it played off rural versus Omaha, because I think today we still very much think of like Nebraska, and then like Omaha, because it's so big, is its own separate sort of thing. So I think the book was very good about showing, hey, that's still how that was still the case in 1942, and showing what the difference in just Omaha versus all of the other 92 counties in Nebraska, how they approached it. So
well, and something that I always wondered about too was the license plates. Because I questioned, it's like, oh, I wonder how we got our numbers, And then
Mhm.
it did talk about that in there. So there was just even some Nebraska history, and it talked about how you had to be pretty tough to live out here in those days because of the tornadoes and the drought and all of those different things. Just things you read in different books. It just pretty much laid it out there and said, if you were strong enough, you could survive here. Otherwise you left or you perished. So I don't know. I really enjoyed learning about the Nebraska aspect, more so even than the national. I think it was just a nice home state book.
They call the state a prairie desert. And they really weren't wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. We finally have trees though.
Yes.
A tickle, I'm sorry.
You're fine. Is there anything else you guys can think of? If not,
If not, thanks for joining us. Our next book club book discussion will be on July 21st at 4 p.m. and will be Good Omens by Neil Gaiman. And you can stop in and check out a copy. And we'll look forward to seeing you guys. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Bye.
Bye.